Wow, we have a conversation about the feedback experience. So let's see. We're going to tackle this question, or we have two people who are going to tackle this question, which is the annual performance review dead? 10% of Fortune 500 companies have eliminated performance reviews or ranking systems altogether. And according to our speakers, the way feedback is delivered in most companies is broken. I'm sure many of us can relate to that, being on the receiving end of getting feedback or being on the end of having to operationalize a talent review or performance management rollout. We know what that experience is. So Shift Positive 360, co-founders Jen Ostrich and Pete Berridge will share insight on how to make feedback more constructive and enjoyable, it can be, for both those giving and receiving it. They'll also discuss positive psychology and key concepts such as strength-based coaching, solution-focused inquiry, and defining desired outcomes. So please welcome to the stage Jen and Pete.
Would you like to receive a gift? What emotion just went through you? What feeling did you have?
Salvation.
Now, what if I told you that the gift is feedback? Did the feeling change? We tell people that feedback is a gift. You only get it so many times in your executive career, receive it openly, constructively, but that's not how it feels. Have you been in that place where you've received feedback before? Think about that for a moment, an experience that you've had where you've received feedback. And make a note in front of you or in your mind of what that experience was like, what that feeling was like.
Maybe even notice what you're feeling in your body as we're saying the word feedback a few times now. Think about what's coming up for you, what experiences you remember when you received feedback, and just maybe capture an adjective or two, some feeling words of what that brings up for you. And I know in all of your roles, you're used to giving feedback as well. So what comes up when you think about some times that you've had to give feedback, whether that be recently or over the arc of your career? Maybe it was just yesterday. What types of feelings come up when you think about giving feedback? Just jot down a word or two, and then we're going to ask you here in a second to maybe just shout out some reactions. So I don't think we need microphones. Just project loudly for our Facebook people. Just shout out some words. What came to mind? Feelings, adjectives.
Anxiety.
Scary.
Scary.
Scared. Uncomfortable.
Empathy. Somebody said something over here. Hope. Vulnerable. Extra work. Sure. Good. Any others? Well, between anxiety and empathy and if vulnerable, it's no surprise that some of you wind up feeling like this when it's time to either give or receive that feedback. And that's exactly why we're here today, because we want to talk about how to change that experience for both you all as being in the primary roles of giving a lot of feedback, but also for those of you who have full staffs back at the agency and are giving and receiving feedback all the time. We believe that feedback in organizations is broken today. Whether it be through a performance review or some sort of 360 feedback system, there's several design flaws. First of all, oftentimes the feedback is tied to whether or not someone's going to get a promotion or a salary increase, so automatically right there the intent is compromised. More times than not, almost always from my own experience in agencies, it's confidential, and so it anonymously comes through. You don't know who said what. That often leaves the person feeling unclear and also just questioning the context or the tone for which it was delivered. Third, more times than not, it focuses on what's ineffective or what's not working, the areas for improvement or the weaknesses. And it doesn't go the extra step to actually focus really on what behaviors do you want to see from that employee. And lastly, a lot of times feedback lacks that level of support that's actually required to see real change. And it leaves people feeling isolated and alone as a result, because not only is the feedback delivered, but then oftentimes it's not tracked, it's not followed up on, and even if the change starts to happen, rarely is it noticed or reinforced. So this is leaving employees feeling isolated, discouraged, alone, and more often than not, as if their colleagues are against them instead of for them, which is just frankly not how it should be. In addition to the design flaws, we feel the way feedback is actually being delivered is also broken. We know from Tom Rath's research in StrengthsFinder 2.0 that if a supervisor focuses on an employee's strengths in feedback, the likelihood of that employee becoming actively disengaged is only 1 out of 100 employees. 1% are likely to become actively disengaged in their role when the feedback is focused on their strengths. What's striking is that number jumps up to 22% when the feedback is primarily on weakness. But what's the most interesting thing is what drives the most disengagement? It's when an employee feels ignored, when there's no feedback given at all. The research showed that the number jumped up to 40%. Nearly half of employees will actively disengage when they're not receiving feedback. So what makes feedback broken in the way that it's designed and delivered? Well, first of all, the fact that it's rarely happening as often as it needs to, and even when it is, the way that it's designed, it's not as effective as it could be.
So we must change the feedback experience to be the positive and constructive experience it was intended to be. As HR leaders, OD leaders, you design systems with the best of intentions to help people to learn, to grow, to become more effective. That's why we put them in place. So let's reimagine feedback. What if we instead were asking people, what is it that you love most about this individual? To uncover their greatest strengths, the things that they do the best. And if we went further and we asked individuals, what could that person do to become even more effective? What would help them to learn and grow? And last, we said that we would be there with that individual to support them, to reinforce those new behaviors when we start to see them. Now, what would it feel like to receive that sort of feedback? Feedback can be really exceptional when you trust the intention of the person that's giving it to you. And when you know the context in which it's offered, you know the circumstances that that particular feedback fits. And you know specifically what you can do to grow. And you also receive that in a timely manner so that you can put it into context again. You can act on it when it's appropriate. And last, that you have the social support, that reinforcement ongoing, not as a one-time episode. So, for example, let's say that you and I are in a meeting, and afterwards we do a debrief. And I sit down with you and I say, I love how you ran that meeting. You're engaged, you're energized, you brought out the best in individuals, you asked good questions. Now, I think there's one thing that you could do that would make it even more powerful. And if you'd like to do this, I'd be happy to watch for it, and that is, try to uncover resistance before we leave the room. Ask people, is there anything that would hold you back from being fully committed? And I think it's going to take it one level further. If you'd like to do that, we can have a debrief after our meeting next week, and we'll see how that goes, and I can offer you some feedback then too. What would it be like to receive feedback in that sort of way?
So today we want to talk to you about how to change the feedback experience. We come to you as two executive leadership coaches that co-created a 360 process that we call Shift Positive 360. But whether or not you use our approach in the 360 context, or you can take back some of these strategies that we're going to talk today and actually start implementing them as soon as tomorrow. We're going to take you through some real strategies and actually model one of the things in our session today. So we're going to get into the how to change the feedback experience, and that's largely going to be through a focus of positive psychology. We're going to talk a minute about what that is and how that shift in mindset can really change the way you're experiencing feedback. Then we're going to talk more about the who's involved, and we know that feedback's got to be bigger than just the person receiving it. So we want to talk to you about how to go back to your agencies and create systems of support, how you can leverage allies around the people that are receiving the feedback and make sure that you're setting them up for success and that change actually occurs. So let's dive in first to positive psychology.
So positive psychology is a scientific study of what's right with individuals, organizations, and communities, well-being or flourishing. How many people have heard about positive psychology at all? Wonderful.
About half.
So Marty Seligman was one of the founders of the field of positive psychology. In 1998, he came in as the incoming president of the American Psychological Association, and he challenged the membership to broaden their perspective in their fields of research. with the idea that growing the positive is not the same as alleviating the negative. And that is a light switch moment. Those are simply different. That mental health is more than the absence of mental illness, that well-being is more than relief of suffering, and studying pathology, distress, and dysfunction is not the same as studying resilience, strengths, and growth. So I think I'm pretty good at solving problems. And I think you're probably pretty good at solving problems and helping leaders in your organization solve problems. But this offers a whole new set of opportunities and resources that we can use to help people to grow. I like a quote from the researchers Rice and Gable, who looked at positive relationships. And they said, in practical terms, the absence of conflict and distrust in a relationship need not imply the presence of joy and fulfillment. So with that in mind, the field of positive psychology has just blossomed. The research that's taking place has just ballooned. And it's really exciting to see. You hear about grit. You hear about mindset. You hear about strengths, positive emotions, post-traumatic growth, and how to get there, and to look beyond just PTSD. You hear about optimism. And these are all constructs that we can bring into the organization and start to change the systems that we've developed that create outcomes that aren't achieving our intent.
So let's dive a little bit more specifically into the how can you change the feedback experience. We want to walk you through 3 strategies. 1, the importance of strength-based feedback. 2, the importance of solution-focused inquiry and the way that you actually queue up the questions when you're looking for the feedback and how that can change the feedback, the type of feedback you get back. And lastly, this idea of desired outcomes and how to make sure you're going the next step to actually describe the specific behaviors you're looking for that person. Strengths-based feedback. So we love this perspective from Marcus Buckingham. What he says is to think about strengths not necessarily so much as just what you're good at, but the idea that strengths strengthen you. So you feel your best when you're operating from a place of strength. They allow you to be in that place of flow, which is the optimal balance between skill and challenge. When we know from the research I cited earlier that when we're getting feedback in our strengths, we're our most engaged, and we know that when we're using our strengths, we're our most energized. So there's an incredible amount of research out now that supports the fact that strength-based feedback and knowing your strengths is incredibly beneficial to your overall well-being. So I remember when I was in advertising that there was this balance between let's make sure that the good stuff is like the same amount of length on the paper as the constructive stuff, or like, you know, let's make sure we have enough things to say you're doing well because we have a lot of things we have to cover that you could do better. It can't be that way anymore. It's so important that people understand when you see them at their best, that you can mirror that back to them. That is a gift. And to help them get grounded in understanding their own strengths, there's things like Strength Finders out there. It's $20. Like, everyone should just have their employees do that and understand what are their strengths so you can start coaching them more to those strengths, because that's how they're going to be able to tackle the rest of the feedback.
So traditionally, once we ask about strengths, people expect that you're going to be asking about weaknesses. But in our approach, we never ask about weaknesses. We never do. It's not that they're not insightful, interesting, informative. They're just insufficient for change. You need to go further. It's fine to start there, but the work just begins there. You need to go further to understand more about what to do. To do this, however, we are battling our biology. How many of you have heard of the negativity bias? Okay? So this is an evolutionary response that's allowed us to be able to pad around on this earth, to survive as a species, that ability to see threats. We notice threats and they take our attention. Negative emotions will trump positive emotions, and a potential threat is going to take our attention. So when you do a performance review, you do a 360, you do a 9-box exercise, you do succession planning, and those negative comments come up, that's what people remember. That's what they're going to focus on, no matter how many others that you have. And so Marty, I was listening to him give a presentation this last fall, and he said we need to teach people how to overcome that negativity bias, how to overcome the default response. And I like how he described this negativity bias. He said the negativity bias is like your tongue. Your tongue is always cruising around your mouth, and it's looking for any intruders. And when it finds that popcorn husk stuck in the teeth, it is going to work on that until it dislodges that popcorn husk. And that's it. That's where the attention goes. That's the negativity bias. It's not very frequently that your tongue is just going, these teeth are so smooth, and this smile is so pretty. So our first step in teaching you this is I want you to swirl your tongue around your mouth. Say, these teeth are so smooth. Take a minute.
Admire your mouth for a moment.
So to overcome this negativity bias in this biology, one approach, other than swirling your tongue around your teeth, is to use a solution-focused inquiry. And there's a saying that the solution doesn't care why the problem occurred. The solution doesn't care why the problem occurred. But we go right into problem solving. And we ask, why did it happen? Who's to blame? What did we do wrong? Why did we lose the account? We get into the room and we have the postmortem. Does that sound familiar at all? Having a postmortem? How often do you get into the room and you have a learning from wins session where you land the account and you bring everybody in and you say, how did we learn about this opportunity? Who was involved? How did the communication take place? What did we do in the proposal stage? How did we put together our team? What did we do before we actually went in to make the pitch? That's the shortcut to the next success. Learning what you did well last time. The solution doesn't care why the problem occurred. When it comes to asking individuals, it's simply reframing questions as, what would it look like? How would we go there? What are potential solutions? How might we move in that direction? What would be the first indicator? And what we know from the research is that a solution-focused approach actually creates more energy, more options, and better outcomes than the solution-focused approach. So think about that as you craft questions in any of the systems that you develop.
This third area we call desired outcomes or desired behaviors. I want you to take a moment and just look at the screen, the saying up here. It's hard to do less of a bad behavior, so instead do more of a desired behavior. Said another way, it's harder to break a bad habit versus just creating a new one. So it's just not enough when we cover weaknesses or what's not effective for an employee. We have to go the step further and help them understand what to do instead. Because if it was so easy to give feedback like that, it's like the person that says like too much when they present and then you videotape them and they're appalled because they had no idea they were doing it that often. What are they going to do instead? How are they going to break that habit? You have to give them something new to focus on. So let me give you an example. I was collecting 360 feedback on a client I'll call Jared. And the things I was starting to hear from everyone I was interviewing was that, Jared talks too much. When you're in a one-on-one conversation with him, he actually has a tendency to interrupt you. And when he's in meetings, how that translates is he totally dominates the room. He's the person talking the entire time, even if there's 8 of us in the room. So I was thinking to myself, is this going to be the most useful feedback for me to take back to Jared? I'm thinking about negativity bias and what we just explained. These are going to be the 3 things that he's going to remember. It's going to make him feel pretty bad. So instead, I started pushing people a little further, and I said, so if you were interacting with Jared in conversation, how would you like him to show up? What would make you feel heard? How should he be in meetings? What are some things he could practice? What are some specific things he could do? And I started to get some really great suggestions. He could just decide he was going to practice on his listening skills. Can he focus and make that a goal? Or what if he just asked me for my input and asked me my opinion and I felt like he wanted to know what I was thinking? Or if he could just come into the room sometimes and say, I'm going to facilitate instead of lead, and he just had that mindset. He could seek more context and try to understand backgrounds on things. And lastly, what if he just was more curious and asked more questions? If Jared chooses even just one of these things, it's not about changing yourself to what everybody suggests, but it's about which one resonates and which one does Jared think he could do more of. If he focused on any one of these, he's automatically going to be doing less of what's on the left. So it's critical that we don't fall short when we're collecting the feedback and we hold people accountable to really naming what it is that they want to see. What is that desired behavior? There's one more important point around why it's important to name specific behaviors, and we're going to illustrate that point through a quick video clip. And you do need to see the initial prompt at the start of the video, so I'm going to encourage you to stop your tweeting or notes for a minute and join us in watching this quick clip here.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Ad for bicyclists, so kudos to whoever created that ad. But
So we don't see what we're not looking for. Unless the stakeholder takes the time to truly think about what that success will look like, the employee will be guessing, and the stakeholder probably won't recognize it even when it does happen. How many of you have seen the moonwalking bear video before? Usually people have, especially in this sort of group. And while we teach people about inattentional blindness, what this is illustrating, one of us will leave the room, change our shirt, come back.
usually Pete. It's a little easier.
Wait. And out of a dozen, 15 people in the room, one person, maybe two, will notice that I changed my shirt. Okay? We don't notice what we're not looking for. And so while it's important for the client, the employee, to understand what they could do, like Jared in this case, it's even more important actually for the person that's being interviewed to be able to name what it would look like, because otherwise they're not going to see it when it happens. They're not looking for it. They haven't gone that far. So with Jared then, it's important for those individuals to have named what it is that they do want in terms of the active listening skills, the facilitation, and so forth, so that they notice it when Jared starts to do it. Otherwise, they'll simply miss it, the reinforcement isn't there, and the behavior fades away. Change of behavior takes a system of support. So we'd like to actually involve you a little bit here and do a little exercise. I want you to take out a piece of paper now and just draw a big T on it, okay? I want you to think about somebody for whom you have feedback to offer. Somebody important to your success, you're important to their success, maybe somebody back at the office, or maybe it's somebody personal. And on the left-hand side of this T, I want you to write down, what would you like to see them change? What's not working? What are those behaviors?
Don't filter it, just write, just like my example showed, talks too much, interrupts people, rude, like anything that is a problem right now. Anyone struggling to think of something?
No, there's a lot of writing going on.
That's good.
Yeah.
Anybody on the Facebook Live, you can do this exercise too. It's really helpful if you have feedback to give soon.
So now on the right-hand side, I want you to start writing down, what would you like to see them do? What could they do instead? What would that success look like? What might be a small step they can take to move in that direction?
The more specific, the better. Remember kind of what is the actual new behavior you'd like to see them embody.
So now I want to ask for a volunteer. Somebody that's brave enough to volunteer.
And we'll want a microphone for whoever volunteers, just so everyone can
Yeah.
hear.
Look at these hands shoot up. Oh, right here. Awesome. Right down in front.
What's your name? I'll have you say it again, just so everyone can hear. Go ahead.
TM.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. So on my left side, I put pay attention to details, retain information, be proactive, take initiative.
Okay. And now on the right-hand side, what would you
Right.
like to see them do?
So on the right side, it was raise your hand more often and ask the team for help, create checklists and set up calendar reminders, take more robust notes during meetings. That's as far as I got.
Good. Take more robust notes during meetings. Say a little bit more about that.
So, just make sure that you take notes if there's any follow-up items, that you're able to put those down so that, you reduce a lot more work on the manager telling you or following up with you.
Okay.
So that kind of takes care of the proactiveness and taking the initiative.
Ah, okay, good. So can you see those behaviors in your mind's eye?
Yeah,
And would you notice those if she started or he started to show those?
absolutely.
Yeah. And good, so what we're looking for then is, as the interviewer, is that something that if I think that the person I'm gonna be showing this to is gonna be able to understand? Is that specific enough, a behavior, something that they can do? And is it something that the person I'm interviewing will actually see in their mind's eye? Because that's where the reinforcement is gonna take place. If you start to see this person doing that, you may well talk to them, or you might just inadvertently smile, nod, lean forward. And it's those little nudges that we give each other that help us to make change. Did anybody struggle with coming up with the right-hand side as opposed to the left-hand side? Nice job. And we have a gift for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what we look for when we're doing this is oftentimes you'll see the individual that you're interviewing, their eyes will come back. They'll start looking up because they have to go inside to think about what is it that they really do want. What will it actually look like? That's when you know that they're more likely to see it when it starts to happen. So as the interviewer, you're weighing those two things. Is it understandable for my client, and are they getting to that place where they're going to see it in their mind's eye? They're going to see it when it actually starts to happen. That's actually the growth. It's one of the key skills, is to be able to stay in that place of uncomfort with a person until they can get there, especially if there's a lot of pent-up anxiety or anger or other ill feelings between those individuals. Our role is to actually nudge people to become allies.
Which takes us into the second area of focus of today, which is around this idea of creating a system of support. So we want to talk to you about three concepts. This idea of building allies and actually setting each person up with having at least one ally that's going to help look for those changes. That's going to help notice when notes are being taken in meeting and initiatives being started. Who's going to be able to reflect that back so that change can actually stick for that person. This idea of two-way accountability. We want to get rid of this idea that if you have the right to give the feedback, then you have to volunteer for something you're also willing to do to help that person achieve that feedback. It's not just give it and walk away and you're done. You have to be part of that process. And the last piece is we want to kind of blow the doors off this idea of anonymous and confidential, and we want to encourage you to think about how to create more open cultures where feedback can be openly talked about. So before I jump to the next slide, thinking about ally support, I just want you to reflect in your mind again. We're not going to share out or anything, but just remember a big change, a big significant change you had to move through in your life. It could be personal, it could be professional, maybe it was a big job choice you made, maybe you relocated, maybe it was a marriage or a divorce. A change that you had to go through, or maybe it was something happened to you and it was unexpected, and so you had to figure out how to move through that change without having even a heads up that it was coming. Who was around you that helped you move through that change? And just thinking back on how did you get there and who was involved? Just quick show of hands. Did everybody at least think of one person that was kind of paramount in moving through that process? Yeah. And that's because what we know is change does not happen alone. Life was not designed to go out alone, and neither was change. It just simply is far less successful if we try to do it by ourselves. And feedback and asking people to work on development areas and changes within themselves is no different. Maybe I asked you to think about a big change, but little small changes can be, I think we all know, just as hard, if not harder, because habits are tough to undo. So there was an interesting study that supports this notion. Marshall Goldsmith, who's kind of like the god in the coaching world in our industry, he did a really interesting study. You can Google this article. It's a great read. Leadership is a contact sport. And what he basically did was set up a study that looked at 8 different companies across 8 different agencies, or excuse me, industries, not agencies. And I don't think advertising was one actually, but, and he set up leadership development programs. So there was a group of leaders that each got to work with a coach. They got a 360, some sort of 360 feedback, and then they worked on naming their specific development goals and areas of focus for themselves. And what the research showed was there was one variable that consistently proved out as the thing that was connected to the leaders that showed the most marked significant change. And that one variable was this idea of ongoing interaction and follow-up with their colleagues. The leaders that shared out their development goals, owned them and told others about them, and allowed their colleagues to notice and reinforce and support and cheer them on when they saw them doing these new behaviors, those were the leaders that saw significant growth. That was the one variable across all the different industries and all the different companies that he looked at. So I want you to be thinking about how are you setting your own people up for success. When you're giving them this support, when a manager is giving a direct report feedback, what is that manager also doing to help reinforce that change when it actually happens? We talked about how it can be easy to miss, and that's why you need to name the specific behaviors, but what else are you doing? You can't just name the behaviors, you have to recognize them when they start to happen, because that's what reinforces the actual new habit that you want to see that person doing more of.
So we know that with social support, we see slopes as less steep, and we feel burdens to be less heavy. Research found that when an individual had somebody standing next to them, or they were prompted to think about somebody that was supportive of them, they literally saw a hill in front of them to be 10 to 20% less steep, as compared to when they were standing by themselves, or they were prompted to think of somebody that was neutral or negative toward them. So the question is, what would it be like for you if you felt your burden to be 10 to 20% less heavy and had that social support around you? So we like this quote at the end of the researcher's article. It says, if social support, opportunities for emotional disclosure, and differences in hope, optimism, self-worth, and self-efficacy cause people to see challenges in a more moderate way, then people who enjoy these resources will live in a subjectively less demanding and less stressful world. Conversely, those deprived of such resources will live in a world where hills are steeper, distance is greater, precipices deeper, and other kinds of physical challenges more daunting and demanding. So as we do our interviews, we ask everybody we interview to identify one thing that they'll do to support the leader, usually based on their own strengths. But what's one commitment you'll make to help that person to grow, that other individual? An example, I work with a leader of an air ambulance system, and I was interviewing the chair of the board, his boss, and the chief medical officer, and I asked this gentleman, what is it that you can do to help this leader grow? And he said, well, you need to understand the circumstances here. When we brought him in, we needed some operational excellence. That was going to be the focus. And he's done that. He's built a great leadership team. The financials are in order. The service is running very well. Now, he needs to get out there. He needs to talk to the member hospitals. He needs to understand what's going on in healthcare reimbursement change and how does that affect those organizations, how will it affect this organization. And so he needs to become externally facing. I said, well, what can you do then? He said, well, I got him a coach. It's like, no, what can you do? He said, well, I can continue to support him. We get together, we talk at least weekly, and we get together for breakfast at least once a month. I said, well, what happens in that meeting? And he went, oh. That's when I asked him, how are the finances? How are the staff? How are the runs going? He said, I'm reinforcing the very behaviors I want to see him change. And it became very simple. What will you do instead? He said, I can ask him about the membership, who he's going to visit, what's going on in reimbursement, what does he think our strategy needs to be? And that became his one commitment. Every week talking with him about those things. And that became then the person that's going to nudge him going forward. So by the close of the interview process, every client will have, every employee will have 6, 8, 10, 12 allies, all willing to do at least one thing differently to support our client to make the changes, to grow as a leader. And one thing to note is that this is a shift, that these interviews are not confidential. We challenge this concept of confidentiality. We need to move to a culture of openness. Colleagues do not sit back passively and fill out an online survey and hit the send button in between meetings or on a 10-minute lunch break and then go on. Instead, they're involved at the beginning. They're involved understanding what the person's decided to focus on, and they're involved well after the coach leaves the engagement to reinforce those behaviors and to nudge that in real time. So confidentiality is actually a symptom of a broken system. If we know how to provide constructive feedback, we don't need to do it confidentially. So back to the beginning of where we started. If we know the context in which stuff is being offered, if we know the intent behind it and the person offering that, if we know what to do rather than what to avoid, and it's done in a timely manner, and we go one step further to know that there's people there to support us, feedback can be a different experience. can be the positive experience it was intended to be.
So in summary, thinking about the traditional approach to feedback and how our approach, the Shift Positive, differs, we spend a lot of time looking at strengths because we understand now why strengths are so important and help keep the people engaged. And we focus on what success looks like and what to do more of. We don't spend time on what was inefficient, what was ineffective, what to do less of. It's simply not enough by itself. We go further and we look at specific behaviors. And how do we get to those specific behaviors? We ask only solution-focused questions. We make sure that we're getting solutions and specific behaviors back as responses for feedback. And we also probe for what the desired behavior would be. What would it look like in the future if it was going the way you need it to be? What would that person be doing? And lastly, we make sure that there's this two-way accountability, that you're not giving feedback unless you're also offering up something that the person can be doing in return to help achieve that feedback. And in order to do that, we have to blow the doors off of this confidentiality. We have to create a much more open environment. We have to build allies of support around each person and help them understand who their allies are, who's going to be looking out for those changes, who's going to nudge me if I didn't take enough notes in the meeting or give me the cue to take more, who's going to be there to support me when I'm working on these new habits. So in closing, we believe that feedback can be the very thing that starts to drive more connection. While it might feel broken right now, and we do believe across every industry that we work in, and I know from 15 years in advertising, it's no different for you guys in this room, that the current process isn't working. We can find our way back to a process that does work, and it's going to involve creating this open environment. It's going to involve taking that extra step as the person giving the feedback, naming something that you can do to support it. And it's going to also involve taking a little more time, like we did in that exercise, to name the behaviors you're wanting to see, to not just take the shortcut and name what's not working, but to go a step further and to name what to do. And then be willing to be the person that's there, noticing it and reinforcing it. We do believe that feedback can be the very thing that helps to bring us back together to an environment of engagement and growth. And I know that's all what you want in your roles. And we actually believe that creating this level of connectedness through feedback can be the very thing that stops the retention problem that I know you're all desperately seeking to solve for in your agencies today. So thank you.